China in the hot seat over its treatment of Uighur Muslims. The UN's Human Rights Council is examining Beijing's alleged crackdown on this minority. But will the growing international pressure make a difference? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The UN says it resembles a massive internment camp shrouded in secrecy. But China says the facility is a vocational education and employment training center. More than 1 million Uighur Muslims are believed to be held in the western region of Xinjiang, a mainly Uighur populated area. Beijing denies accusations of the mass detentions, saying Uighurs who've been involved in crime are being given a second chance through vocational work. But the centers where they are thought to be detained have come under increasing scrutiny by many rights groups. During questioning at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on Tuesday, which is reviewing China's human rights record this week, Beijing said it protects the freedoms of ethnic minorities.
The Chinese government protects its citizens' freedom of religious belief, administers religious affairs in accordance with the law, and fosters active and healthy religious relations. We protect the rights of ethnic minorities in accordance with the law. All 55 ethnic minority groups are represented at the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference.
Al Jazeera's Adrian Brown got a rare access to China's Xinjiang province, where most of the Uyghur community lives. Here's his report.
There are few more difficult places for foreign journalists to report from in China than Xinjiang, especially now. The province's vast security and surveillance network is in overdrive as international criticism mounts over China's internment program for ethnic Muslim Uyghurs and other groups. Officially, Chinese government officials insist they're providing free vocational training for those deemed vulnerable to Islamic extremism. But exiled Uyghur activists say these centers are nothing less than re-education camps, where up to 1 million men and women are being held indefinitely without charge.
Chinese government is doing that without international repercussion. So I believe that China would accelerate its step to wipe out the whole Uyghur nation if the world wouldn't be stronger, harsher on China.
Tahir Amin believes he'd be in a camp if he returned to Xinjiang. He says a Chinese state security agent tried to persuade him to go back after he moved to Israel to study early last year, leaving his wife and daughter behind in Xinjiang. The agent, also a Uyghur, telephoned him repeatedly, wanting details of Amin's contacts in Israel. Sometimes the calls were taunting. Your daughter won't turn out to be a scum like you, says the voice. She'll be useful to the Communist Party. The implication was clear. Her fate was in their hands.
He said, one day you will need support. One day you will need assistance from the Chinese government if you go back to your homeland. Your family members, your wife, your daughter still are in Urumqi.
Before Imin left China, he lived here, Urumqi, the provincial capital of Xinjiang. He used to call his daughter all the time, but in February she told him, "Don't call me or my mother again." Her last words to her father were these: "You're a bad person." With so many people missing in Xinjiang, including his brother and sister, Amin is not sure if his wife and daughter are safe. He also doesn't know for sure if they're still in Urumqi. His wife divorced him just after he moved to the United States, but he understands why. Marriage to him, he says, has made her a marked woman. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, in Urumqi.
All right, before we get to our guests, let's take a closer look at China's Uighur community. They're a largely Muslim Turkic minority, mostly based in the semi-autonomous Xinjiang province in the far northwest. They regard themselves as culturally and ethnically close to Central Asian nations like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. An estimated 10 million Uyghurs live in Xinjiang. That's around 45% of the population there. But in recent decades, large numbers of ethnic Han Chinese have migrated to the region. Uyghurs accuse Chinese Hans and the government of discrimination and abuse. In recent years, there have been riots by Uyghurs, and they've been blamed for several attacks. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us here on set is Max Oitman, Assistant Professor of History at Georgetown University. In Beijing, Einar Tangen, Political and Economic Analyst. And joining us on Skype from Washington, Sophie Richardson, China Director at Human Rights Watch. A warm welcome to you all. Max, let me start with you. Just how much pressure exactly can the UN Human Rights Council bring to bear on China right now?
It's a good question, one which I think that perhaps Sophie or people who are directly involved in the human rights community might be able to answer better than I am. But taking a step back and looking at the current situation more broadly, I think we live right now in a moment where it's easy to be quite cynical actually about the power of journalism, about the power of academia, about the power of human rights organizations to raise these issues and actually affect change on the ground, especially in places like China, which are seemingly very powerful and very immune to global criticism. But I think that the situation that has been unfolding in Xinjiang actually is breaking that mold to some extent. It's really been the efforts of journalists, places like Al Jazeera, organizations like Human Rights Watch, the work of a wide and growing network of scholars that have actually brought this crisis to global attention. And I think that this is a policy, actually there's a set of policies, and hopefully we'll talk about that more as this program goes on. But the detention centers and the other parallel policies, I don't think people in China who made these policies expected them to come to global attention. They really didn't think about the ramifications that these policies would have when they were perceived around the world. So actually what's happened, in my opinion, is that the work of journalists and other organizations has really done a great job of bringing this to the world's attention. And I don't think that events like what happened today, where there was a session at the United Nations Human Rights Council or other types of places, are going to stop China in its tracks. I don't think that's going to dismantle the detention centers anytime soon. These are massive pieces of infrastructure which aren't going to go away. But I do think that the global attention that we're bringing to this issue may potentially alleviate conditions within these camps. And perhaps more importantly, it may force China to create a less arbitrary process by which they intern people. And I think that would be a big victory, small victory. But one of the really frightening things if you live in Xinjiang right now is just the utter arbitrariness of the current detention campaign system.
Sophie, I saw you nodding along as Max was speaking, so let me ask you the same question. First of all, what are your thoughts as far as what you heard Max say, but also do you believe that what happened in the UN Human Rights Council today, could actually bring pressure to bear on China?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, China's idea of a successful review would have meant that nobody had raised criticisms about anything. And so the fact that at least a dozen governments called out the existence of the political education camps in Xinjiang and called for their closure and or for an international investigation of them is significant. And it's precisely the kind of pressure that we can build on. That said, I think it's worth pointing out that if just about any other government in the world was arbitrarily detaining up to 1 million Muslims, we would see a very different reaction within the UN system. We would almost certainly see a call for debate at the Security Council, the swift establishment of a fact-finding mission, the appointment of a special rapporteur. But China's power within the UN system is such that many of those avenues to justice are closed off. And the challenge really is going to be for individual governments to push collectively with themselves, but also through the UN system for that kind of accountability.
Einar, there are those who say that the Chinese government is trying to rid China completely of the Uyghur ethnic identity. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's a bit ridiculous. I mean, quite frankly, the Uyghur population is less than half of the Muslim population. I shouldn't say Muslim because it's really, they're classified as ethnic minorities. And quite frankly, many of them, not many, a certain percentage of them do not actually practice, are not practicing Muslims. It's a very different type of situation in China. And from the Chinese government perspective and also society, if you talk to people, they'll say, listen, they don't want any kind of civil insurrection. They don't want terrorist attacks. They were shocked when there was a gang of terrorists who attacked people in a subway station in Shanghai. They're appalled when they hear about massacres of Hans up in Xinjiang itself. So there's a high priority. The government is under tremendous pressure to keep order. If they don't keep order, they have failed their first duty to civil society. And from the Chinese government's point of view, they say, well, what are we supposed to do if we allow people to skip school, not study Chinese, do not learn any kind of useful trait that could get them off their rural, impoverished areas? Then we will be feeding a cancer that could possibly grow, because young Xinjiang people who do not have the skills to get jobs are, basically locked into a pattern of rural poverty. And if that is the case, they will lose hope and they will become, from the Chinese government's perspective, easy prey to groups that are preaching that there is some sort of justification in going independent. The Chinese have a very firm line on this issue of separation, fractionalizing, this type of thing. They do not want to see their country carved up into little bits because one group or another group believes that they should have an independent state. So although there are plenty of complaints, I cannot affirm or deny all the allegations that have been here. I have not been there. I have not seen them. I can tell you that it's a very difficult conundrum for the Chinese government. They have to do order. They have to be seen as pushing this, and if they don't, they will be, in essence, being criticized by the majority of people if there are, in fact, terrorist attacks.
Max, you heard Einar there talking about stability and security from the point of view of the Chinese government. First, let me ask you, how much of it is actually an aim of the Uyghurs to have an independent state? And secondly, how much of concern really is security there in Xinjiang for the Chinese government?
I think that to answer the second question first, the Chinese government is, as Einar has pointed out, very concerned about security, the overall security of this region. As has been mentioned, in 2009 there were large-scale peaceful protests initially, which then became quite violent ethnic street battles in Urumqi between Han and Uyghurs. I was outside of Urumqi at that time and arrived in Urumqi just several days later, and I didn't witness the violence, but I saw what was happening in the immediate aftermath. And China's concerns about the security of this region are not misplaced necessarily, right? They have also, on the other hand, these are small incidents. They are relatively small incidents, which in no way challenge the overall sovereignty of the PRC in these regions. So to some extent, people trying to explain the current policies need to try to figure out why it is that the state is engaging in such draconian policies when none of these individual incidents ever really amounted to a serious threat against the state, right? On the other hand, another thing that your speaker mentioned was that that you have these there's vocational training centers and so on, and the government's very, very interested in, at least it claims to be very interested in giving Uyghurs more skills to succeed in the modern Chinese economy. But the fact of the matter is that these sites are not really training people in vocational skills. I was in Xinjiang recently. I spoke with some contractors who were building these institutions. They told me that they were certainly workshops in certain ways, but they were not training people necessarily in a lot of vocational skills. What they were primarily emphasizing was re-education. The current main purpose of China's the detention system and a whole set of other larger policies are to really change fundamentally the way that Uyghurs think. They want to make sure that Uyghurs recognize the legitimacy of the Chinese state and they want to make sure that Uyghurs begin to quite proactively identify themselves as Chinese. And these are things which Uyghurs did not necessarily do 10 to 15 years ago.
Sophie, could you tell our viewers more about what you and your colleagues here is going on in these centers?
Sure. We published a report in September that documented not only the fact of arbitrary detention, there's no legal basis for these facilities in which people are held. And I think one of the best ways of challenging the notion that these are vocational training centers is to ask why they're surrounded by barbed wire and why people can't call home to their family members. We spoke to about 60 people, about 5 or 6 of whom had been in political education centers, and they described to us torture, ill treatment, psychological torment, humiliation, being forced to study Mandarin, being forced to recite government propaganda. And the fact of the matter was there was no way of knowing how long you were going to be held, and really the only criteria for being released was demonstrating sufficient political loyalty. But I do want to come back to the point about security on a couple of levels. First of all governments have an obligation to provide public security or public safety for their citizens. There's no dispute about that. But that not only has to be proportional to what the actual threats are, but it also can't encroach on basic human rights. And I think if we flip the conversation around to talk about security for Uyghurs in Xinjiang, we're talking about a region that has for decades had a very heavy state security presence, that has an appalling reputation for torture and ill treatment at the hands of the authorities, where people are heavily surveilled, up to and including having party officials move into your home to monitor your behavior. We've watched the Chinese government systematically hunt down and terrorize Uyghurs overseas. So I think if we're going to have a real conversation about where the security threats are in Xinjiang, let's round out that picture and make sure we're not just talking about the government's perception of the handful of incidents that we're talking about and whether they in any way justify the responses that we're seeing in the region right now, because they don't.
Einar, a growing number of voices are saying that Muslims in other parts of China need to start worrying about their own ability going forward to practice their religion in China based on what is happening to the Uyghurs. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily correct. I think at the moment they're actually very near to settling some sort of accord with the Vatican to allow some sort of joint arrangement over religion, at least Catholicism. This idea that somehow this is going to spread to other ethnic communities, other Muslim communities, has not actually been shown yet. And I understand there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and also documented evidence that is being put forward here. But I'd like to at least introduce this idea that, in the West, the balance between the individual and the state is always tipped towards the individual. We believe that, right to trial, liberties, freedoms, and things like that are axiomatic to our, quote, natural rights of human existence. But if you go to the East, life is a little bit different. The state and the society takes precedent over the individual. And this is part of Confucianism. It's not just communism. It's something that's very much ingrained. So when we start talking about how, we perceive things should be done in another country, we have to be a little bit careful that we're being broad enough to understand that there are different cultural attitudes towards this. And as I mentioned before, even small incidences involving violence and death are considered, just beyond the pale here. You don't have the kind of situations that you have in the U.S. where you have, massive shootings going on every week and people terrorizing each other and, lots of guns and things like that. They do have incidences. There was an incident where somebody deranged attacked school children. It happens on occasion. But it's a far cry from the kind of violence that people are perhaps used to, even in Europe and around America. So from their perspective, from the Chinese people's perspective, they have a very, very low tolerance for any kind of violence like that. You can walk the streets of Beijing at night as a woman at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning without any fear that somebody's going to mug you or rape you. So their tolerance for this is much lower than ours, and their ideas about the fit between individual and society are quite different.
Sophie, it looks to me very much like you want to jump in, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor here.
Among other things, I'd love to have a conversation with you about the safety of women in China and whether people can walk the streets without fear of rape. I think that is a gross misrepresentation of not only that reality, but let's be very clear here. We are not talking about culture versus communism. We're not talking about East versus West. We are talking about black letter law in binding international treaties that China voluntarily signed. All right, this is not up for dispute. These are the standards that China chose to adhere to or say it would adhere to. This is not something that, this is not an essentialist, an orientalist, a culturalist argument. This is about the law.
Max, let me ask you, how are Muslims in other parts of China being treated?
So Muslims in other parts of China are also experiencing a shifting policy environment. This came to my attention a year and a half ago when I was traveling in Ningxia, the Hui Muslim Autonomous region, and local interlocutors began to talk about how the construction of mosques was being delayed or postponed, and people were being quite overtly encouraged to, if they were able to build a mosque, to build it in a so-called China style or a Chinese style. More recently, at the so-called the two meetings of the National People's Congress and the National People's Political Consultative Congress this past year, the Chinese head person of the Chinese Islamic Association, which is a united front organization, now directly again under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, announced a new broad policy which articulated this policy of which we'd seen sort of early signs of 1 or 2 years ago. And this policy is called the Chinification of Islam. So if in Xinjiang, it is essentially, from what I can tell, a crime to be a Uyghur. In other parts of China, it's increasingly activity which is not acceptable, according to a sort of Chinese standard, is increasingly sort of a crime as well. And there's a sense that if it does not seem to coalesce very well with mainstream Han Chinese perceptions of what minority culture should be, well, then it needs to change. And so the Chinification of Islam, which is happening all across north-central China, is a facet of this new policy. So you can travel to mosques in northern China right now, and you'll see that Arabic language inscriptions have been whitewashed over. People are being asked to rebuild their mosques in a more Chinese style. Contacts between Chinese Muslims and Muslims abroad are being severed. So this is having real ramifications for Chinese Muslims within China, and they're deeply, deeply concerned that the kinds of things that are happening in Xinjiang will trickle into the interior.
All right, Sophie, we only have about a minute and a half left, so please bear that in mind as you're answering. Look, for our viewers, from your perspective, of course, this is not the first time that China's human rights record has been in the news and has been criticized. Where is China's human rights record now under the leadership of Xi Jinping versus before he was in office?
Well, we've documented significant rollbacks, particularly in areas where we've seen some progress in recent years. Some positive trends with respect to the rule of law, with more tolerance of independent civil society, allowing contacts with counterpart communities, religious NGOs, for example, outside the country. And we've seen a really breathtaking rollback on all of those fronts, but also a significant increase in the monitoring, harassment, surveillance, and intimidation of communities across Xinjiang, across Tibet, in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, we see China taking some of those abuses abroad. We've documented in the last couple of years, particularly Chinese government efforts to undermine human rights mechanisms at the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And those are systems that are critical, not just for monitoring what's happening inside China, but around the world. And so, pushing back against these abuses has consequences, not just within China's borders, but for everyone.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Max Oitman, Einar Tangen, and Sophie Richardson. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.